Hey nutrition nerds, and welcome back to another video. Today is going to be a slightly different video to usual, as I'm playing back an interview I had with Andrew from IronmanHacks about low carb, high fat diets. In the interview, I chatted with Andrew about low carb, high fat diets for triathlon. We covered all sorts of different topics during this and whether it might be beneficial or detrimental for triathletes. I gave my opinion on this, on whether it's something that triathletes should consider. So I'll play that for you in just a moment. Before I do, I would suggest that you check out IronmanHacks on YouTube, and I've put a link in the video description for you. There's lots of cool interviews with some triathlon greats and some awesome other topics, so you should consider subscribing and watching those videos. Alrighty, so let's play back this interview. If you've got any questions, thoughts or comments after you've watched the interview, then I would love to hear them. I enjoy some good healthy debate, and this is one of those topics which always brings it about.
Thanks, James. Well, today let's talk about LCHF. What do you think?
It's a big topic and a lot of people like to have an opinion on it. I think it's really interesting. For those who don't know, it just as LCHF, low carb, high fat. So we're talking about reducing the amount of carbohydrates in your diet, increasing things like fat and protein, and whether there's any benefits on performance. So I have a lot of things, I guess I could say, on low carb, high fat, because I think it's really interesting. Now, I suppose to give a bit of background on it, the premise is that we have almost unlimited stores of fat. So in terms of kind of the ability to race all day or to push performance, you have an energy source which doesn't run out. We've got about 60,000 calories worth of energy stored as fat.
That's a long Ironman.
Yeah, absolutely. That's enough for about 3 to 4 Ironmans in a row. So, the potential is amazing, but when it comes to carbohydrates, we've got about 2,500 calories worth stored as carbohydrates. So you've got the problem there that will run out. That will run out in 90 minutes or so, maybe even 2 hours, if you're pushing it. Obviously, it depends on intensity. So the aim is you get better at burning fat, which means that then you can use more of your fat stores rather than your carbohydrate stores, so you can race for longer. And that's kind of where the premise of this low carb, high fat comes from. You use a fuel source you've got unlimited amounts of. So the theory is brilliant. And it's a tough one. So the idea and the ways to kind of improve it is to reduce the amount of carbohydrates in your diet, because by doing that, you push your body to use more fat to burn. Because you have that reduced amount of carbohydrates, it's still got to fuel its exercise somehow. Therefore, you get better at burning fat. The problem is, and where it gets tricky, is that the harder you work, the more carbohydrates you have to use. And so the harder you work, the less fat you use, which is why you want to get better at burning fat, because what you want to do is essentially get better at burning fat at a higher intensity, because when we race, we're going to be working harder.
So James, just to ask you a question, is that why they say, like if you look at basic cardio for fat burning, they tell you to, go slowly, like walk, don't sprint, or, don't go at your fastest pace on the treadmill in the gym. Fat burning zone is the low heart rate zone, that kind of thing. Is that what that's about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is right. I mean, so there's always going to be, we always use a little bit of carbohydrates, even when we're in that fat burning zone, we always will. But yeah, essentially, the higher you go, and when you're doing high intensity training, you don't use any fat. And that's basically because the pathway to use fat is a little bit slower, takes more time to use the fat, essentially. So yeah, that's why it says the fat burning zone is lower. And so when you're working on that fat burning and increasing that metabolism, you have to naturally work at that lower rate to get better, because otherwise you're not targeting the right thing, which is why you'll see the kind of zone 1, zone 2, depending on how you want to term it, it is all at that lower threshold. But the idea is you get better at it. So the better you get at burning fat, even as the intensity increases. And that's the kind of aim of the low carb, high fat.
So that's what we call fat adapted, right?
Yeah. And the kind of better fat adapted you are, the more fat you use, the more glucose or glycogen you spare.
So essentially, instead of me who runs out of glycogen from my liver in 2 hours, I'm going for 6 hours and I'm still feeling good. And I'm doing an ultra marathon in the woods with no nutrition on hand, with nothing on my body, not carrying anything, not stopping at any 7-Eleven. And I'm still going for 6 hours. Or in my Ironman, I don't need to stop at the aid station. I don't need to worry so much about fueling because my fat stores are fueling me, and my glycogen my liver glycogen or my glycogen is still intact. And so I'm not bonking. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, that's the aim. I mean, so the two things. One is that so you've got liver stores, glycogen in your liver stores. You've also got a much bigger amount stored in your muscles, and that's actually kind of what we're targeting is trying to save the muscle glycogen. But the premise there is absolutely right. So that you're using fat stores to go for hours and hours and hours without needing nutrition. But where it falls down is that we have to use carbohydrates and we have to keep topping them up, because unless we're going really, really slowly, the use of carbohydrates is going to outstrip the use of fat. And then we are one way or another going to bonk, unless we are very, very fat adapted and going slow enough. And that's where it becomes interesting when it comes to Ironman racing, because the theory is brilliant in that you get much better at burning fat, therefore you don't really need aid stations, you can just keep on going. But as I said, the harder you work, the more carbohydrates you use. And it's very clear that even if you're very well fat adapted, you can't do an Ironman without taking in carbohydrates if you want to race to your maximum potential. It's just there's too much of a mismatch between your energy sources there.
But aren't there so many elite triathletes who are following this kind of diet, who do take in nutrition? I mean, they do take the nutrition during the race, right? But they are on a low carb, high fat diet, and they are fat adapted. So it's kind of like insurance for them. But then during the race, they fuel like a conventional guy would. Is that?
Yeah. And so I think there's a big variation is what I'd say. Firstly, when it comes to racing, I think it is reasonably unequivocal in that carbohydrates are good and you need to take them in for your racing. It's whether using a low carb, high fat diet over the long term is beneficial. Now, it might be, but at the moment, there's just not enough evidence to suggest that it's good for long-term training, because while you might increase that fat burning potential, what you miss out on is a lot of the high-end stuff. So it means that you wouldn't be able to fuel high intensity training, to fuel hard intervals or those tough workouts, because you just don't have enough carbohydrates stored as glycogen. So that's where it's kind of important to think what's better over the long term for continuity of training and consistency. Because if maintaining a kind of normal carbohydrate diet or a traditional high carbohydrate diet as an endurance athlete means that you can maintain your sessions, you can have really good quality sessions and keep that consistently over the long term, that's going to be very beneficial. There's no doubt. Elite athletes aren't elites because they take lots of time out of training. It's because year after year they keep training. The issue with the low carb diets is that there's a potential to not consume enough. You then can't fuel your top end training, so you're not going to get that quality training. The other issue is that it's quite easy to run into not eating enough generally. Fatty foods are a lot, they can be they're high calories, so that's good. But it's quite common that if someone just goes on a kind of high fat, high protein diet, that they don't eat enough, because it can be quite tough to just eat high protein, high fat foods. And there's the risk then that you just don't fuel yourself enough and you really get yourself into a bit of a pickle because you don't eat enough.
But couldn't a guy like that do a combination maybe? So like really go on a low carb, high fat diet. But then when the hard days come where he has to, do intervals or do like heavy bike training or, high power outputs or, whatever that may be, take some nutrition at that time. Wouldn't that be an approach?
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that's becoming more popular is the kind of premise of fuel for the work that's required. And so by that, it's if you know you've got hard sessions coming up or hard block, then you appropriately fuel with sufficient carbohydrates to do that. And that's definitely a possible strategy. And there's things like it's called sleep low, train high, sleep low, which is essentially you're doing a high intensity training with loads of carbohydrates. Then you sleep with a low amount of carbohydrates. You train the next day with a low amount of carbohydrates. So you push that fat metabolism. I think that's a very possible strategy, and it's probably good. We don't have loads of evidence on that at the moment. But the other thing to consider is timeframes of how long it takes for your carbohydrate stores to replenish. So it could be anywhere between 24 to about 72 hours. And if you think how much triathletes train, it's a lot. It's often 1 or 2 sessions a day, and maybe even 3-4 sessions a day, and often every day, and a day of rest a week. If you're doing lots of high intensity work, you're essentially playing catch up. So if you're only eating carbohydrates just when you need them, there's a risk that that's still not going to be enough to fuel it.
And that the lag or the windows are too big for it it's not an instant thing, is it? So
no,
it's not like quite. Just during this 1 hour, I'm going high carb, and the next at 11 o'clock, I'm going low carb. It doesn't work that way, does it?
It doesn't work.
It smooths out through the day or through a 3-day period almost, right?
Yeah. And there's also other things to consider in that we know when we follow a low carbohydrate diet and a high fat diet, it's to do with our genes. It's to do with the way we actually process the fat. We get better at doing that. And that's what we want. But as a side effect of that, we are worse at processing and using carbohydrates. So the issue there is balancing out high quality training versus trying to become fat adapted. Because if you're thinking, I want to improve my fat metabolism, but then you aren't as good at processing sugar or burning sugar, then you can make your high intensity workouts suffer. So it's just trying to balance that out. And at the moment, we don't have really good evidence to know what it's like over the long term. There's some good stuff out there. What we definitely know is low carb, high fat is bad for high intensity or the real top end stuff. And when it comes to racing, and that's definitely something to be clear on. If you want to race as well as you can and you're really trying to push it, you need carbohydrates to fuel it.
Okay, so getting to the bottom line, you just said it. It comes at a cost of high intensity training ability without having those instant carbs. And I'm extrapolating from that. Some people could say, yeah, but I'm doing an Ironman, I don't ever go fast. Or I'm doing ultra marathons, I don't go fast. But to do an Ironman well, you have to do the volume, sure, but you also do intervals, you also do speed work, you also do all these other things leading up to it, right? Unless you're telling me you don't want to do that.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, even when you're doing the slower stuff, you are still going to be using an element of carbohydrates. And you can't get away from that. You're never not going to be using any unless you're on a kind of ketogenic diet. And we know, again, that's generally not great for racing. So although the argument might be, I'm going slow, I'm not doing that, you still have to have an adequate amount of it because otherwise you will run out and you will bonk. So yeah, I think you summed it up quite well there.
So James, could I open this up to viewers who disagree or who feel like it's really unequivocally the best way to eat and to train as a triathletes, and this is the way it should be done? You've got people like Dan Plews, you've got people like Dave Scott. I mean, it's hard to argue with these guys. Some of the best in the world, the best age grouper and I'd say, debatably the best pro of all time almost out there on this. So
Yeah.
if people have their opinions or their positions, I'd love it if they could tell us in the comments and we could address those. And maybe we could do another video on that. Maybe we could bring them in. Maybe we could discuss it with them or people similar to them.
Yeah, I think that's good. And it's important for nutrition and for sports science in general for people to disagree and have another view. And probably what's fair to say is that everyone will be different and will have different abilities to process foods. So some people might find they get on better, but currently the science suggests that certainly in terms of performance, carbs are still king. So if people want to disagree or share their experiences, their opinions, that would be awesome. And I'd love to hear them and would happily respond and chat with people about it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that interview. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think low-carb diets have a place for triathletes? Or do you think that it's something that they just shouldn't bother with? Let me know in the comments section what you think on this. I've got a couple more interviews coming up with Andrew from IronmanHacks about this. And as a reminder, if you haven't already, do go check out his channel. If you did find this useful or interesting, then I would really appreciate it if you gave the video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, then do subscribe to this channel. Remember to press the notification icon to make sure you get an alert when I release a new video. And remember that subscribing is free. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time. See ya.